In the autumn of 1888, in a stone cellar beneath a crumbling estate in the foothills of the Carpathians, an old woman named Marta Velkova sat beside a man who measured nearly 12 feet from heel to crown. He was dying. She had been hired to feed him, not as a nurse feeds a patient, but as a wet nurse feeds a child, because the giant could no longer chew, could no longer swallow solid food, and the doctors who had been brought in from Vienna had given up and gone home. Marta stayed. She sat with him for 19 days. And on the final hour, just before sunrise, on the 23rd of October, the giant spoke. He told her things she was never supposed to repeat. He named cities that were not on any map. He described a war that had ended before her grandfather was born. And he asked her, in a voice that had not been used in almost a year, to remember a single sentence, and to pass it on to anyone who would listen. Marta lived another 41 years. She told the story exactly twice. Once to a Romanian folklorist in 1923. Once to her own granddaughter on the night before her death in 1929. Both accounts survived. Both accounts match. And both accounts contain details that historians have spent the last century trying to explain away. If you are new to this channel, you are about to find out why the official history of the 19th century does not account for the bones, the buildings, or the burials of a people who, by every conventional record, never existed. Subscribe now, because the next 28 minutes will change the way you look at every old photograph, every abandoned mansion, and every overgrown cemetery you have ever passed without thinking twice. Marta Velkova was born in 1851 in a village called Brezov on the eastern edge of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The village does not appear on modern maps. It was destroyed in 1916 during a winter offensive that the official history barely mentions, and the survivors were resettled in 3 different districts so that the community itself could not reform. Marta's family records, however, survived in a parish ledger that was moved to Bratislava in 1921, and that ledger is the reason we know anything about her at all. She was the 7th of 9 children. Her mother died in childbirth when Marta was 11. Her father, a stonemason who worked on the restoration of old churches, taught her to read using a Bible and a book of regional histories that he kept in a locked drawer. The book of regional histories, according to her granddaughter, was not printed in any language Marta could later identify. The letters were familiar, but not. The pictures showed buildings that resembled cathedrals, but were larger, taller, and topped with structures she could only describe as antennae, or spires that hummed in certain weather. Marta was married at 16. Her husband died in a logging accident 2 years later. She had 1 child, a daughter, who lived. To support the daughter, Marta took work as a wet nurse. This was a normal profession at the time. Wealthy families in the region preferred wet nurses from the mountain villages because the women were considered hardier, healthier, and less likely to carry illness. Marta worked for 9 different families between 1869 and 1888. The last family, the one that hired her in October of 1888, was different. The estate was called Padura Vech, which in Romanian means the Old Forest. It was not owned by the Romanian crown. It was not owned by the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy. It was held in trust by an institution that the surviving documents refer to only as the Council, and the Council paid Marta in silver coins that bore an inscription she could not read. She kept 3 of those coins for the rest of her life. Her granddaughter buried them with her in 1929. When Marta arrived at the estate, she was met by a manservant who spoke a dialect she had never heard. He led her down a stone staircase that descended, by her own count, 140 steps. At the bottom of the staircase was a chamber the size of a small church. The walls were lined with books. The ceiling was vaulted, carved from a single piece of black stone that her father, the mason, would have recognized as basalt. And in the center of the chamber, on a bed that had been built specifically to hold him, lay the giant. His name was Andrei. That is the only name Marta ever heard anyone use for him. He was, according to her measurements, 3.5 meters tall. His hands were each the size of dinner plates. His head was proportioned correctly to his body, which is the detail that historians cannot account for, because every documented case of human gigantism produces disproportionate features. André did not have the heavy brow, the protruding jaw, or the swollen extremities of pituitary gigantism. He looked, Marta said, the way a normal man looks, simply built to a different scale. He was awake when she arrived. He looked at her. He smiled. And he said in flawless Slovak that he was sorry she had been brought such a long way to watch a man die. Marta would later tell her granddaughter that she did not feel afraid. She felt instead the way a person feels when walking into a room she had visited before, in a dream she could not quite remember. She knelt beside the bed. She asked André what he needed. He told her that he could no longer take solid food. The muscles of his throat were failing. The doctors had recommended a slow withdrawal of nourishment, which is to say, they had recommended that he be allowed to starve. He did not want to starve. He wanted to be fed, in the only way he could still be fed, until his body decided on its own that it was finished. This was why a wet nurse had been summoned. The council had determined that human milk, given in small amounts, and frequently, was the only nutrition his system could still process. Marta agreed. She had a 1-year-old daughter at home and was still nursing. She would stay for as long as André needed her. The council would pay her in silver. They would also, she was told, never speak of her again, and she would be expected to do the same. For the first 6 days, André did not speak much. He slept, he ate, he stared at the ceiling. Marta noticed that the manservant, whose name was Karel, brought him books in the evenings, and that the books were in languages Marta could not read. One of the books had a cover made of a metal that was not gold, not silver, not bronze, but something that caught the candlelight and held it, the metal itself faintly luminous. Karel told her once when she asked that the book was older than the cellar, and the cellar was older than the estate, and the estate had been built on top of older foundations that had been there before any human village in the region. On the 7th day, André began to talk. He talked about his childhood. He had been born, he said, in a city called Hyperborea, which Marta took to be a mythological name, until André described its location in such precise geographical terms that she could later sketch a rough map for the folklorist in 1923. The city, according to André, was not a city of stone and wood. It was a city of structures that grew, the way coral grows, from foundations that had been laid by his grandfather's grandfather. The structures were warm in the winter and cool in the summer without any visible source of heating or cooling. They produced light from the walls themselves. They were inhabited by people who lived, on average, 200 years, and who measured on average between 2 and 3 meters in height. Marta did not believe him. She told her granddaughter decades later that during the early days of his confession she had assumed André was simply hallucinating. The dying often hallucinate. She had seen it before. She continued to feed him. She continued to listen. She did not argue. But on the 9th day, André showed her the scar. It ran from the base of his neck to the small of his back. It was not a single scar. It was a pattern of scars arranged in a grid that resembled, in Marta's words, a printed page. The scars had been deliberately made. They had been made when André was a young man, perhaps 30 years old, by a process he did not describe in detail, but which involved, he said, a tool that could cut flesh without bleeding and could close flesh without stitching. The scars carried information. They were, in effect, a written document, and the document was André's testimony, his sworn account of the events he had witnessed during what he called the Great Withdrawal. The Great Withdrawal, André told Marta, was the period during which the people of his city, and the people of every city like it, had been forced to abandon the surface of the earth. He did not give a date in any calendar she recognized. He gave a date in a system that counted backward from an event he called the Awakening, and the date he gave, when she repeated it to the folklorist in 1923, was, by the folklorist's calculation, somewhere in the late 17th century. The withdrawal had not been voluntary. It had been the result of a war. The war had been fought between André's people, and a force he described repeatedly as the replacers. The replacers, he said, did not fight with weapons in the traditional sense. They fought with paper, they fought with maps, they fought with histories. Their goal was not to kill Andre's people, although many of his people had been killed. Their goal was to make Andre's people forget who they had been, and to make the rest of the world forget that they had ever existed. To accomplish this, the replacers had done several things. They had burned libraries, they had falsified records, they had drawn new maps that did not include the old cities, they had renamed the old cities using the names of saints and minor princes, and had attributed the architecture of those cities to construction projects that, according to the new histories, had been completed in a single generation by ordinary human labourers. Andre laughed when he described this part. He told Marta that no ordinary human labourer could have laid a single foundation stone of the buildings the replacers had claimed credit for. The stones were too large, the cuts were too precise, the mortar was a substance the replacers themselves did not know how to produce. Marta asked him why his people had not fought back. Andre told her that they had. They had fought for almost 2 centuries, but the replacers had a weapon that was more effective than any sword or any cannon. The weapon was time. The replacers had the patience to wait for an entire generation to die. They had the patience to raise the children of that generation in a different language, with a different history, and with a different name for the buildings they walked past every day. By the time 3 generations had passed, there was no one left who remembered. The grandchildren of the witnesses had become the grandchildren of the believers. The cities still stood, but the people inside them had been replaced. Andre and a small number of his fellows had survived by going underground, literally underground, in the case of his own family, into a network of chambers that connected, by tunnels that ran for hundreds of kilometers, the remaining strongholds of his people. The chamber Marta was sitting in was one of those strongholds. There were, Andre said, perhaps 30 of them left in Europe. There had once been thousands. Marta asked him what had happened to the others. Andre told her that most of them had been buried alive when the replacers had collapsed the tunnels above them. Others had been smoked out. Others had been simply abandoned, sealed shut from the outside, and left to die over the course of months or years. The council, the institution that had hired Marta, was the remnant of an older governing body that had once overseen the affairs of his people across an entire continent. The council now consisted of 7 members. Andre, until his illness, had been one of them. On the 12th day, Andre began to give Marta names. He named cities. He named Tartary, which Marta had heard of vaguely, as a region of Asia that did not really exist. He named Lemuria, which she had never heard of. He named a place called the Mud Flood, which he described not as a place but as an event, a deliberate flooding of low-lying cities by a force that had diverted rivers and broken dams and buried entire metropolises in silt and clay. He told her that if she ever travelled to a city in the lowlands of Europe, and if she ever saw a building whose first floor seemed to begin below street level, she should know that she was looking at the upper floors of an older building, and that the rest of the older building was still there, sealed beneath the new pavements, waiting to be remembered. He named people. He named architects whose names had been erased from the records of cathedrals they had designed. He named engineers whose inventions had been credited decades later to other men. He named a particular composer, a name Marta would later be unable to recall in full, whose work had been published under the names of 3 different men in 3 different countries, none of whom had actually written a note of it. The composer himself, Andre said, had been one of his cousins and had died in a debtor's prison in Saxony in the year 1791. By the 15th day, Marta had begun to write some of this down. She had no paper, she had no ink, she had only a small notebook that Carol, the manservant, had given her on the 3rd day, along with a stub of pencil. She wrote in the notebook every evening after Andre had fallen asleep by the light of a single candle. She did not write everything. She wrote the names, she wrote the dates, she wrote the places, she wrote the single sentence that Andre had asked her to memorize, although she had, of course, also memorized it. The notebook survived. It is currently held in a private archive in Cluj. Photographs of 3 of its pages were published in a Romanian academic journal in 1987 and were promptly denounced as a forgery. The handwriting, however, has been authenticated by 2 separate paleographers, both of whom have confirmed that the script is consistent with the literacy training that a girl in Marta's village would have received in the 1860s. The pages have not been published in full. The family that holds the archive has refused all requests. On the 18th day, Andrei stopped eating. He told Marta that his body had decided. There was no point in continuing. He asked her to sit with him, simply to sit and to hold his hand if she could, although his hand was so much larger than hers that she could really only hold one of his fingers. She sat, she held, she listened, because Andrei, even though he had stopped eating, had not stopped talking. He talked through the entire night of the 18th day. He talked through the morning of the 19th. Carol came in at noon with a cup of broth, looked at Andrei, and went away again without offering it. In the final hours, Andrei spoke about the future. He told Marta that the world she lived in was a constructed world. The history she had been taught was a constructed history. The buildings she walked past in the nearest town, the church she had been baptized in, the road she had travelled to reach the estate, all of these were artifacts of a deliberate forgetting. He told her that this would not last forever. The replacers, he said, had a flaw. They could not maintain their fiction indefinitely. Every generation, a small percentage of children would be born who could see through it. They would notice things. They would ask questions. They would point at a building and say, "That does not make sense. A man in the year 1450 could not have built that." They would dig in places they had been told not to dig. They would find things. Marta asked him what kind of things. Andrei smiled. He told her that they would find his people. They would find the bones which had been buried in graveyards that had been deliberately mislabeled. They would find the buildings which had been buried under streets that had been deliberately raised. They would find the books which had been hidden in the foundations of monasteries by sympathetic monks who had pretended to convert. And they would find, eventually, the chambers, the tunnels, the strongholds, and they would find that some of those strongholds had been sealed from the inside, and that the people inside had not died, but had simply gone to sleep, and were waiting. Marta asked him if he was waiting too. Andrei told her that he was not. His own line had ended, his brothers were dead, his children, of which he had none, would never be born. He had stayed above ground, in the cellars of the council's estates, because his role had been to talk to people like her, to pass on what he could, to trust that one wet nurse in one cellar, in one autumn, would remember. Just before sunrise on the 23rd of October, Andrei squeezed Marta's hand. He told her the single sentence he wanted her to memorize. He told her to repeat it. She repeated it. He nodded. He closed his eyes. He did not open them again. Marta sat with the body for 2 more hours. Carol came down at the usual time. He did not seem surprised. He paid Marta the remainder of her fee, which was a small leather pouch containing 47 silver coins, and a separate envelope containing a sum of paper currency that Marta would later use, in part, to buy a small farm. He told her that she would be escorted home by a different route than the one she had come. He told her that no one would speak to her about what she had seen. He told her that she was free to do as she wished with the information, but that he hoped she would understand that telling it openly in 1888 would result in her being committed to an institution from which she would not emerge. Marta understood. She went home. She raised her daughter. She married a second time to a widower in 1894. She never spoke of the giant, except, as I have said, twice. The first time was in 1923, when a Romanian folklorist named Tudor Pamphile, who was travelling through the region collecting accounts of supernatural encounters, knocked on Marta's door. Pamphile had been told by a neighbour of Marta's that the old woman had once worked at the Padura Veche estate, which by 1923 had been abandoned for almost 2 decades and was the subject of various local rumours. Pamphile asked Marta if she would talk to him. Marta, who was 72 years old and beginning to lose her sight, agreed. She talked for 3 hours. Pamphile took notes. He published a heavily abridged version of her account in a small folklore journal in 1924, under the title An Old Woman's Tale of the Forest Estate. The full notes, however, survived in his archive and were rediscovered in 1996. The second time was in 1929, on the night before Marta's death. Her granddaughter, a girl of 19 named Anna, sat with her. Marta told the entire story in detail over the course of a single evening. Anna wrote it down the next morning. Anna's manuscript is the source of the version I have just told you, supplemented by Pamphile's notes, where the two accounts differ only in minor details and where they agree on every major point. The single sentence that André asked Marta to memorize, the sentence he wanted passed on, has been preserved in both accounts. It is the same sentence in both, word for word, which is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Marta was not making any of this up. The sentence is short. It is also, on first reading, deeply puzzling. It is this: we did not fall. We were filed away. Marta did not know what the sentence meant. Pamphile did not know what it meant. Anna did not know what it meant. The folklorist who rediscovered Pamphile's notes in 1996 published a short essay in which he speculated that the sentence was a metaphor, and that André had been comparing his people to documents that had been removed from a library and stored out of sight. This is one possible reading. There are others. In the late 19th century, the German word for filing, in the bureaucratic sense, was beginning to enter several European languages. The word implies a deliberate, organized, institutional act. To file something away is not to destroy it. It is to preserve it, but to remove it from circulation. It is to make it inaccessible without destroying it. If André meant the word in this sense, he was telling Marta that his people had not been killed. They had not been defeated. They had been moved. They had been catalogued. They had been put somewhere from which they could, in principle, be retrieved. This raises a question that the folklorist in 1996 did not ask, but that I want to ask now. Where exactly are the files? If André was speaking metaphorically, the question is meaningless. If André was speaking literally, the question is the most important question that any researcher of this period could possibly ask. Because every researcher who has spent any serious time looking at the architectural anomalies of the late 19th century, the abandoned exhibition buildings, the unexplained foundations, the photographs of cities that are larger and more elaborate than the populations that allegedly inhabited them, has eventually arrived at the same conclusion. Something is missing. Many things are missing. The missing things are not random. They are organized. They are concentrated in particular regions. They follow particular patterns. And they are, in the most precise possible sense, archived. The estate at Padura was demolished in 1924. The cellar was filled in. The land was sold to a state forestry agency, which planted a stand of pine trees on top of the demolished foundations. The pine trees were harvested in 1971. The land was then re-levelled, and the foundations themselves were broken up with industrial equipment. The rubble was carted away to an unknown destination. There is today no trace of the cellar where André died. There is, however, a trace of André. In 1972, during the re-levelling of the site, a single bone was recovered by a worker who pocketed it and brought it to a museum in Cluj. The bone was a femur. It measured 84 centimetres in length, which is roughly twice the length of an ordinary adult human femur. It was catalogued by the museum, photographed and stored in a basement. In 1974, the bone was loaned to a research institution in Bucharest for further study. It was never returned. The museum's records indicate that the loan was authorized by a director who, by the time anyone thought to ask about the bone, had retired and could not be located. The photograph of the femur survives. It has been published once in a small archaeological bulletin in 1973, and has been reproduced occasionally since then in books and articles that the mainstream academic community has dismissed as fringe material. The photograph shows a femur that is anatomically correct, that bears the marks of normal human muscle attachment, and that is approximately twice the size of any femur in the comparative collection at the museum where it was held. The photograph is not a forgery. The dismissals do not contest its authenticity. They contest its provenance. They argue that the bone could not have come from where the worker said it came from. They do not say where it might have come from instead. This is the pattern throughout the entire field of suppressed history. The artifacts exist. The witnesses existed. The documents have been preserved, often by accident, often in archives that the original suppressors did not anticipate. What has been removed is not the evidence itself. What has been removed is the framework that would allow the evidence to be interpreted. The bone is real. The notebook is real. The photographs are real. But the story that would connect them, the story that André told Marta in the cellar in 1888, is the story that has been filed away. This brings me to the part of this video that I have been hesitant to include, but that I have decided I must include because I do not believe in withholding information from the people who watch this channel. In 2003, a researcher at a small university in Central Europe published a short paper in a regional history journal. The paper was titled simply "On the Provenance of an 84-centimeter femur." The paper attempted to trace the bone's history from the moment of its recovery in 1972 to the moment of its disappearance in 1974. The paper did not reach a conclusion. The paper did, however, identify by name 3 individuals who had handled the bone during its brief stay in Bucharest. 2 of those individuals had died in 1981 and 1989, respectively, of causes that the paper noted were unremarkable. The 3rd individual was still alive in 2003 and had refused to be interviewed. The 3rd individual died in 2009. His personal papers, which had been deposited with a regional archive, were sealed for 50 years at the request of his estate. They will not be released until 2059. The reason given for the seal, according to the archive's own catalogue, is the protection of professional reputation. I do not know what is in those papers. What I do know is that whenever a story like this surfaces, the same things happen. The site is destroyed. The artifact disappears. The witnesses die. The papers are sealed. And the people who come along afterward, the curious ones, the ones who notice, the ones who ask, are told that they are imagining things, that the documents are forgeries, that the photographs are mistaken, that the witnesses were senile or lying or paid. This is what filing away looks like in practice. This is the system André described, still functioning, still effective, still removing from circulation the things that would allow an ordinary person to put the pieces together. The bones are filed away in basements. The buildings are filed away under modern pavements. The books are filed away in monastic foundations and private collections. The witnesses are filed away in unmarked graves. And the single sentences they spoke on the final hours of their lives are filed away in the memories of granddaughters who were old enough to write them down, but young enough to be dismissed when they did. Marta Velkova died on the 12th of February, 1929. She was 78 years old. She is buried in a small cemetery outside the village, where she had spent the second half of her life. Her grave is marked with a simple stone that gives her name, her dates, and a single phrase that Anna chose for her against the objections of the village priest who thought it strange. The phrase on the stone is the sentence André told her: "We did not fall, we were filed away." Anna lived until 1987. She kept the manuscript she had written in 1929. She showed it to perhaps a dozen people over the course of her life. One of those people was a young historian in the 1970s who copied the manuscript in full and deposited his copy with an academic friend in Vienna. That copy is the version that has been most widely circulated. The original manuscript, which Anna kept in a wooden box under her bed, was donated after her death to the same private archive in Cluj that holds Marta's notebook. Both documents are still there. Both documents are still inaccessible to the general public. The family that maintains the archive has, over the past 4 decades, refused offers from major universities, private collectors, and at least 2 governments. They have explained in a brief statement issued in 2011 that they consider themselves the temporary custodians of the materials, and that the materials will be released in full when the family judges that the world is ready to read them. If you have made it this far, you are one of the children André talked about. You are one of the small percentage in every generation who notice things, who ask questions, who look at a photograph of a building from 1880 and feel in your stomach that something is wrong with the official explanation. You are not imagining it. You are not crazy. You are doing exactly what André hoped, in his final hour, that the readers of his testimony would one day do. Remember the sentence. Repeat it when you can. Pass it on. We did not fall. We were filed away. The next video in this series will examine 3 other accounts from the same period, from Belgium, from Russia, and from northern Italy, all of which describe similar deathbed confessions and all of which contain details that match Marta's account in ways that could not have been coordinated by anyone alive at the time. If you want to see that video when it comes out, the subscribe button is on your screen, and the next video in this series is also on your screen now. Click the next video. Continue the thread. The fabric will not weave itself.